Hello everyone, thanks so much for joining. We're speaking right now in beautiful Budapest. We're currently at the Lithium Ion Battery 2023 conference hosted by SMM, the Shanghai Metals Market. I'm very fortunate to have Adriana and Rob with me from MViro. We're going to share some insights on LCAs and carbons and all of these important topics related to batteries. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Great, maybe Rob, let's start by introducing your organization and what you do, your company.
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Robert Pell. I'm the founder and CEO of MViro. What we do at MViro is everything you can imagine associated with life cycle assessment. So measuring the environmental impact. Many people are familiar with carbon footprints. What's the carbon intensity of products or processes? And life cycle assessment fundamentally includes this, but it includes many other impact categories as well. So measuring the environmental impact of products and processes, and this might be things like land use footprints, water-related scarcity, things relating to biodiversity, so many impact categories. And our focus is really in the energy transition space. So we work with raw material producers, mineral processing plants, refineries, as going right through to cathode, anode manufacturers, cell manufacturers, and then going right through to OEMs. Don't stop there, we go right through to battery recycling. And other parallel sort of low carbon tech like PV, motors, wind turbines, stuff like that.
Fantastic, thank you. And maybe, of course, I think there's a lot of talk about that, right? Like people know, okay, we want to have a more sustainable industry, but there's still a lot of challenges to overcome. Maybe also a bit from a technical perspective or like how it's kind of set up from an R&D perspective. Adriana, maybe can you share a bit about like how does this all work? How does this done?
Yeah, for sure. I can shed some light on that. So I'm part of the research and development team here at MViro. I've been doing battery LCAs for the past 2 years. So I think I kind of have a good idea of what's going on in the battery industry, and specifically of what's going on in the very upstream. So MViro, as Rob mentioned, we deal with environmental impacts across supply chains. And this is very specific, employed by the so-called life cycle assessment methodology. And this is very important nowadays because we are seeing that this is the go-to methodology that is being considered in regulation. So I'm talking specifically about the European battery regulation and the carbon footprint of the batteries. This is really important because it will need to be quantified by means of the life cycle assessment methodology. For all the batteries that will be sold in the European market. So this is especially important for this conference because we have a very impressive Chinese audience and Chinese presence. So this will affect everyone, not just European battery manufacturers, but also people from the outside.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And I guess, if you look at the space and you mentioned, for example, biodiversity, and I just came back from another conference and we had this discussion about, it's not only carbon. I don't know if people think it's only CO2, and in some way it's a good metric because it's one, right, you can use and it's quantifiable. But of course there's many aspects around it. So I guess I'm wondering maybe from your perspective, if you look at perfect, the holy grail, we trace it all and we reduce everything and we increase or reduce depending on which way it makes sense. How far are we? Like where are we staying today? What would you say is the state of the land?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can see by the regulations, there's a narrow focus on the climate change impact or the carbon footprint. And although this is sort of a big step and improvement in the industry to actually get this as a regulation and a requirement across the full life cycle of a product, it still doesn't hold the sort of the central premise of life cycle assessment, which is that you're trying to understand a holistic view of sustainability. And if you imagine, so for example, if you're optimizing a system to reduce the climate change impact, you want to make sure that there's no unintended consequences. You don't want to have increased impacts on biodiversity, on land use change, things like that. But if you fundamentally think about, you step out a little bit and you look at the global challenge, we're fundamentally trying to electrify our transportation system to optimize it for climate change. So I think that's why there's such a narrow focus on that impact category. But I think as the industry and understanding of sustainability evolves, I'm hopeful that we'll adopt sort of the true life cycle assessment approach, which captures those broader range of impact categories.
If I may add, the European Commission is doing a good job on this one. For example, I'm talking about the Critical Raw Materials Act proposal. In that proposal, we can see there's a section for the environmental footprint of the critical raw materials, and they are suggesting to use the life cycle assessment methodology, but they do not specify carbon footprint. They do specify environmental footprint because it will depend on the most relevant environmental impact of that production route that you are assessing that you will need to report on, as Rob mentioned.
Yeah, I was going to just add one more thing as well, which is just to highlight that life cycle assessment as an approach is a tool in the toolkit. It doesn't replace like environmental impact assessments or local assessments. You can kind of think of them as understanding the local impacts versus global impacts from different processes.
I think it's an excellent, very important point, and more recently, for whatever reason, I had to look through a lot of permits, and when you start new factories, and as you say, there's a lot of local assessments as well, which are quite crucial. And I think one thing maybe also looking at different scope, right? Scope 1 to 3, people talk about that. Where do we stand with that? I mean, as I've heard a lot about, again, also another here conversation, also another conference about carbon adjustment mechanisms. So I see that there's a lot of conversations about how well can we actually, how well can we capture the different scopes? So maybe also a bit of your learnings there, your perspective, and where we're standing today.
Maybe I'll briefly touch on our experience in the battery materials value chain. It's essential to capture all these scopes. So scope 1, which refers to direct emissions from sort of combustion, or you get out of a stack or out of a truck at a mine site. Scope 2, so embodied emissions of electricity or heat or cooling in some instances. And then you've got upstream scope 3, which is the embedded impacts of all the chemicals, reagents, consumables that you might use. And this is super important because inherently a lot of these processes, if you think about hydrometallurgy as an approach, you're using chemical work to liberate or refine materials. And so you need to understand the embodied impact of those chemicals. It can be challenging. It is sometimes a step change in actually getting all that data, but you can see that many companies are really sort of like accepting this as a challenge and including it. So you have full scope 1, scope 2, and upstream scope 3.
Great. And I'm not sure if there's something you can say to that. I'm just wondering, because we see a lot of different things, right? You're like in the data of the companies, and you see lots of different things. And I'm wondering maybe, because we also looked at all kinds of like new processes, for example, for mining. There's a lot of discussion, like essentially any process in the battery value chain, someone's trying to innovate and reduce. And I'm just wondering, like based on what you have seen, you have seen some very interesting developments, something which maybe surprised you, something maybe people should know more about, it's maybe different than people think. Just wondering if there's anything like that.
Yeah, well, actually, I do have one example, and it's related to recycling technologies. In this case, battery recycling, for example. We did some work evaluating the environmental impact of the recycling process that one of our clients had in place. And it turned out that the environmental impact of that technology was not that low as they would have thought, because in reality, we are evaluating a process. A process has its embodied impacts, and it will never be zero. That's impossible, in my opinion, and we quantify that. And one more time, I would like to highlight the importance of the life cycle assessment methodology, because it's a methodology that it's very robust. It's based on the ISO standard 14040 and is robust. It's scientifically robust. It's based on data, energy and mass energy inputs of your process. So it's a reliable methodology that you can trust, and you will find out the environmental impacts of your production process, which necessarily are not always as low as you think.
I think that's a really important point, and also getting the real numbers into this. So I'm sure people can ask you if they want to assess it and get some good results on that, or some more real results. Great, and maybe what's something maybe you hope for, if you like, if you would have a session like this in 5 years or 10 years time, like what do you think hopefully has changed, like in the sector?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's been many discussions about, we're just at the start of this. Like we're a pretty young company, and we've seen the industry shift enormously and adopt these types of approaches in 5 years since our formation. But what you're seeing is another step change in a requirement for primary data. So at the moment, if you're a battery company or you're an OEM, or you're relying on a lot of secondary data, and the existing background databases were quite low resolution. So you might have an industry average data point for the whole of the nickel supply chain. And what we've tried to promote over the last few years is highlighting that actually every route is unique and it has its own unique footprint. We published a white paper highlighting that nickel sulfate, the difference between the low impact and high impact routes, has a difference of 18 times. And so what we really need is primary data for all these different supply chains, so that we can actually not just penalise that aren't performing well, but highlight those ones that are doing good, selecting those low impact suppliers, paying more sometimes to make sure that they have these long-term agreements with these sustainable production routes.
Fantastic. Great, and I think the sun is on our side. It's very beautiful, but no, we really appreciate it, and I hope I guess, as you say, I think bringing more visibility to sector is crucial, and I think also to make the right decisions. So I think I fully agree on this, and excited to see your ongoing journey from here. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.